Welcome, listeners, to Artist Tales, the podcast that features and celebrates artists from different walks of life. I'm your host, Heather Martin, and in this episode, I'm speaking with J Nash, who's a photographer based in London, but originally from Leeds in Yorkshire. Welcome, Jenny.
Hi, Heather.
So tell me a little bit about yourself and your photography and how you got started.
So, well, as you said, I'm from Leeds because somebody's got to be from Leeds. In Yorkshire. Yeah, and I came to London for university in 2014 and I haven't left since. How I got started, I kind of, when I came to university, I wasn't really, I wasn't in a good place really. I had quite a difficult kind of upbringing, I guess, like quite a lot of challenges, but I'd always liked taking photographs, and I think I kind of saw uni as, free money, student finance, I can run off to London and just sort of escape who I was and whatever. And I was quite self-destructive and kind of, I think photographer Rosie Martin once described when she was younger, she said she courted displeasure. And I think that is probably a good way to describe me as well. But yeah, long story short, I did my BA in 2014, and through having really the most incredible teachers who sort of went above and beyond, probably recognised that I was a bit of a mess and I was involved in a few self-destructive habits, shall we say, that weren't great for me. They kind of pushed me along and really gave me quite a lot of like self-belief. And they basically inspired me to sort of do something with my life and change my life. And I really owe them everything after that point, because I really think I was on the like a crossroad at that time of like my life was going to go really badly or end abruptly, or I was still going to be here today. So yeah, it was kind of down to that. But I'd always taken photographs, always, like when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I always had to have the mobile phone with the best camera. Or even when I was little, I used to have the little disposable camera that I would take around and snap, and my mum would go to Boots and get my pictures developed and that kind of thing. So yeah, images have always been a really important part of my life. I think I've sort of realised that that's because I think Nan Goldin said she used to take photographs of people and places, I think, because then she thought she would never lose them. But actually you do, and having the photos kind of remind you of what you lost in a way. So I think I was in this kind of weird cycle as a young person of taking all these photos and desperately trying to save everything, and I couldn't, because things change, things move on, and that was kind of like a vicious cycle, I guess. Whereas now I kind of, photography is therapeutic for me, and we'll probably talk about that more later, but I think what I do creatively now is kind of, I use photography to explore ideas of what home means. I'm really interested in that idea of home is where the heart is, because that's not necessarily always true. Landscape is a huge thing for me because obviously I come from Yorkshire, there's lots of gorgeous landscape there. I have a funny kind of relationship with where I'm from, so that's something I'm exploring. But I am a documentary and protest photographer as well. So photography is a way to convey messages or feelings, or kind of, I think everything we photograph is a self-portrait, a photographer said to me once. So I think everything that I do, I'm just sort of trying to inject some energy into the work beyond sort of pressing the shutter or developing a film, I guess. I kind of want to see what's behind, under the surface of a picture, I guess. And it's a way to kind of discover more about yourself and various selves that we have inside us. But yeah, and I like that kind of exploration of photographic representations of people and places, and because that's always, like I say, was always changing, and it's fluid and it evolves, and I do some mixed media stuff as well, some sculptural stuff, photographic objects, which is kind of me having a go at creating the imperfect image, I guess.
How much has the struggle in your life influenced your art, whether it's photography or the mixed media or whatever. How much has that influenced you? And I think as I was saying that too, how much of it was the release? Because he said that particularly taking pictures was kind of therapeutic, So how much, because I know with a lot of artists, maybe not all, but many artists, kind of what they've been through and what they've experienced can influence how they see things and how they, express themselves in art.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, but also kind of like from the sounds of it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it almost was like a release for you with all the other things that you were, experiencing.
I guess, like I said before, like when I first sort of came to London and my poor teachers didn't realise what they'd taken on, accepted onto their BA photography course. I think I was quite an angry person, and it's funny because I actually had a BA teacher who still to this day is a pretty angry guy. Like he always shaking his fist at the world, and I think that's one of the things that he actually taught me inadvertently. He would probably disagree with this, is that it's easier to be angry than to be sad. I think that's why people can be so angry all the time. And I think there was quite an interesting thing so the actor Jim Carrey said that he's an actor because he's broken, and his art, acting, allows him to kind of, I think he said, reconfigure all those broken pieces. And he also said something about, I think he said that artists, when they get hurt, they try and turn that into something really beautiful. And I think that's what I kind of try to do. I don't want to be maudlin. I don't want to be dwelling. I don't want to be, oh, this bad stuff happened to me, poor me, that kind of thing. If I ever make a very personal piece of work, my artist statement is always it's about my method. It's kind of, until very recently, I actually exhibited 3 parts of a series where I had to, because of the nature of the work, because it was raising awareness of something, I had to say what the project was about, and I never do that. That is the first time I've done it. I was very scared to do it. I was very nervous, and I had some fantastic people around me supporting me. Lovely Lizzie Brown, who's a wonderful photographer, and Mal Wolford as well, and Eve Milner, and yeah, and that was pretty tough for me. But I don't want to, like I say, I don't want to be shouting at an audience not coming around an exhibition to go to be your therapist or be your pseudo parents that you're projecting this aggression onto, or maybe lost a past love or somebody who you're pissed at. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I'm always very general with my artist statements. I'll talk about method or theory or research. I don't say, oh, this project was about me when I was 10 and this happened, or when I was 15 or whatever. Because I think, like, when you can become, like, chronic outrage or chronic anger is a very real thing, and people don't realise that. Like, and a lot of people do become chronically angry or outraged through suffering trauma. And being angry as a person or hurt can actually be protective, because it's like a proactive way that we kind of seek out potential threat to us, if that makes sense. But being chronically angry all the time or outraged, it leads to like really bad stress, burning out, because you're pouring out all this endless like aggressive emotion and being angry at something or shouting at walls. I used to do a lot of, when I was a teenager, I used to do a lot of shouting at walls because I didn't have the kind of the guts to say it to people that hurt me. Or I knew that if I did, I would be in a lot of serious trouble. So I didn't. So I did a lot of shouting at walls when my mum was at work, when I used to get home from school, I used to do a lot of shouting at walls, or kind of talking to myself. Like I would there'd be nobody else around, and I would say all these things that I wanted to say to people. I'm kind of going all around the houses, but what I kind of was trying to say was that you burn out. People get so stressed or burn out because of this stuff, and because they're unconsciously trying, in their unconscious, they're trying to rise above their own trauma. And that's why processing trauma, and it doesn't always work for everybody. Not everybody is creative or artistically inclined, but like processing trauma through art practice, or in my case, photography, is absolutely critical for me to create in a piece, and ultimately for me to be in control of myself as well. And I am diagnosed with bipolar, so I mean my moods can go very up and down, even though I have to take medication. So that's my way of keeping me level. But you can't get that control. What I've learned is I can't get that control. And I've found other people have said this, you can't get that control until you recognize your own pain and you're willing to face it and you're willing to deal with it. And, everybody deserves that. You do. Anybody listening to this does. Like, everyone deserves that. And I think that's what art and photography can do for people, I think, if that makes sense.
It does. And while I was listening, I was going to ask you, it sounds like the photography and the art allows you to process a lot of that trauma, the anger, and whatever other emotions that you're working through or feeling. But also just, to your point about not saying too much in the artist statements, I'm a bit like that as well. Not that I necessarily work through the same thing as you, but can do it. I mean, I think it can be cathartic, as you said, but also it's the thing I'm also conscious of is the viewer, because the people who come to see it will interact it, they'll take away their own interpretation of it. And I don't like to say too much, because I want that person to kind of take away what they want. And I just wanted to ask you kind of where in your mind does when you are exhibiting, where in your mind do you think the viewers, or does that matter? Do you just kind of show stuff for yourself, really? Or, yeah, because I guess it's that interaction with the viewer who comes to see the exhibition.
No, it's interesting you bring that up, because I do work with self-portraiture, not as much as I used to, but I have worked with self-portraiture in the back. When I was on my MA, and Rosie Martin, who was one of the developers of phototherapy with Joe Spence in the 80s, she was very helpful on this. But when I was doing these self-portraits, and subsequently when I've done other quite dark-looking work, it does drum up emotions in people that come and see it, and they sort of project their own meaning onto it, which is what I kind of like about the vague artist statements. Like, I don't want to say, oh, this image is about this, because I'd quite like somebody to come and it means something to them and they project onto it. And I always find that interesting. Like, I had a self-portrait where a man spoke to me at an exhibition, and he was really emotional, and he actually bought a print, and he said, oh, this reminds me of hands down of my gender reassignment surgery. And he was like, it's just so perfect. And he was telling me all the reasons why. Well, I've never, that portrait is not about gender reassignment surgery. I've never had gender reassignment surgery, So it was absolutely nothing to do with that. But that was his projection. That was his thing. But also I think there's a responsibility within that as well, because I once had a woman at an exhibition absolutely lose it. Not the private view, thank goodness, because I wouldn't have wanted us to be around that many people, but she absolutely lost it. She was triggered so badly by one of my portraits, and it reminded her of actually sexual abuse that she'd gone through, which again, my picture wasn't about. But she was triggered so badly, she just had this massive meltdown in the gallery, and I was there, which I was quite glad about. I was invigilating that day, and it was actually that I mean, we ended up the gallerist ended up calling a family member to come and pick her up, because she was really, and I did stay in touch with her, to be fair, and we follow each other on Instagram. But I suddenly realised, oh, this is quite a responsibility if I'm going to talk about certain things that can trigger people. I then ended up doing a certificate I decided to go and do an online course in how to deal with people who are having panic attacks, or that they're triggered by, something traumatic. Or so if I ever am around and I managed to upset somebody, at least I can take a bit of responsibility. Do you know what I mean? But me and that woman did have a very long conversation about things, and she was very. I mean, she felt terrible. She felt awful, like she ruined our day, and I was like, no, it's amazing that somebody had a strong reaction to it, but at the same time, it was kind of. She said it was kind of a relief because she could kind of, oh, here's a picture that describes what I can't describe, which to me was like that's pretty amazing for somebody to suddenly have a way to kind of describe something they haven't had the words for, if that makes sense. Like, it was horrible it had to happen that way, but yeah, I thought that was pretty amazing. It was an amazing thing, I think.
So really what I'm hearing is, in a way, you've given someone a voice or a way to kind of voice an aspect of herself that she perhaps struggled to voice or to express. And in a way, it made me think of a BBC program with Mary Beard, who is I think she was former dean at Cambridge. She's a classicist, and it was about forbidden art, actually. She has a few programs on BBC, but an aspect of it was really fundamentally about art that challenges us, and often art that gets censored. But I think in many ways what you're describing is probably art that can challenge us, and how do we deal with that? And as you say, as artists, what responsibility do we have to present art, but also push the boundaries and challenge things in society? And I'm just thinking there have been so many different types of arts and different artists that have pushed the boundaries and what's acceptable and what's not. She's bringing up, pieces of art that challenged maybe 30, 40 years ago that today we're like, and?
Yeah.
But it's just kind of that world of art. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about that and the responsibility of artists as well.
Well, that's the thing. It's like, so if I'm going to use that picture as an example, that picture particularly that she had a reaction to, or even that series, that was me. That was photography giving me a voice where I was shouting at the walls. But actually, inadvertently, what I did was actually give somebody else a voice as well. And I think that's important. That's one of the things. I think contesting the existing discourse around what photography is really important, because there's this huge hang up about, let's face it, I think maybe somebody might correct me, but photography's only really been considered an art form for 50 years, maybe 60, I don't know. And at the beginning, it was like, oh, only black and white film photography is art. Digital's not art, it's colour is not. It was always black and white. And then there's that toss up between, there's always that argument around, oh, is it science or is it art, or, what it is, because we're using chemicals. Well, artists used to make their own paints, okay? It's like, but it is that challenge. And it's like, I think anything outside of the box, it's like people think it has to be a flat print in a frame on a wall to be considered art. I had that massive conversation with, there's Ian McLaren, who's absolutely fabulous photographer. He's in the Venice Biennale at the moment. There's Rashida Manjera, who was in a show that I curated, who do these kind of sculptural, photographic objects or sculptural things. And I think that is so valid, but it gets labelled as fine art. And people have such a kind of boxed in view of what photography is. It's like I get sick to death of, so I mentioned Joe Spence and Rosie Martin earlier. The amount of times you hear people, and I'm talking academics, quote unquote photography experts, whoever, talk about the self-portraiture of Joe Spence. It wasn't self-portraiture. Technically, in technical terms, it wasn't, because her and Rosie Martin and other people, and Rosie works with other people now, photographing each other. So in a technical sense, it wasn't self-portraiture as we think of it. But their photographs were portraits of the self, which they were photographing different selves. And people find that really hard to get their heads around. That, oh, that's therapy, that's psychology, that's psychotherapy, that's not, proper photography. And it's just, I find that really gutting, because photography is like this fluid, like I was talking about objects, like living, breathing objects, I exhibited a piece in Crouch End not long ago, and it was an A3 piece, mixed media piece. It had broken glass and photograph in it and goodness knows what else. It was one of those mad moments of making that I had. And it was up there on the wall and it was finished, quote unquote. And then I found out from somebody who visited the show, who was a frame expert, that the frame was a 1930s frame, and I just found that frame lent up against a bin in London Fields in Hackney, but that was amazing. And this guy used this term, oh, it's like you're touching the past, and that's totally without him knowing any background to that. So it's like, it's this really, photography doesn't necessarily have to be flat print, it goes so much beyond that, and beyond pretty landscapes and pretty still lives, or like there's so much other stuff under the surface. Do you know what I mean?
There is, and I know some of the people you mention, and I've been to the Crouch End exhibition you mentioned as well, which is in North London. So yeah, it is. I think there is that, like a lot of art, there's a lot of overlap between different mediums, and I've spoken to other artists who wouldn't describe themselves as just a painter or just this or just that or just the next thing. It's kind of, well, I do mixed media, and I spoke to someone for the series who said, I'm a maker, which is a lovely way of saying it. And it's just kind of recognizing that she makes things and, she does different things. And it's just that kind of idea. But I think too, art can get very pigeonholed and then it's kind of become stale. But I think what art, photography, whether it's photography or other mediums, can also, it is that fluid, but it also can challenge the discourse of the day. It can challenge mores and norms and that sort of thing, and quite powerfully. And it's interesting about the Mary Beard program that I talked about, that often that stuff gets censored at the time.
Yeah.
And yet it then becomes acceptable quite often, or I don't know quite often, but, then it's kind of like, oh, okay, what was the fuss about? And things move on, so I think it kind of, that fluidity in art and photography and other mediums kind of reflects society and the fluidity of society as well.
Well, it's like, I think as well, because I do protest photography as well. And it's like, I photograph every protest, whether I agree with what's being demonstrated about or not. I go far right, far left, and everything in between, because I want my protest archive to reflect the time that I lived in. I don't want it to just be one-sided. I want it to be a documentation. And, as much as I absolutely love going to far right demos. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't want to be around those kind of people. I don't want to be around that kind of language. I don't want to be at the Tavistock Centre with people maunging outside about, transgender reassignment therapy being child abuse. Like, it's just ignorance. It's vile. And I don't enjoy that. And I don't want anyone to think I enjoy being at an EDL rally. But that's what I want people to know. I want it to be like a documentation. But I think we do have, you're saying about representation, we have a responsibility. I think, for example, if you've got any of the major privileges, so if you're heterosexual, if you're cisgender, if you're white, if you're male, not necessarily all of the above, but I'm saying, one or two, or, I'm white, for example, which is a huge privilege. We have a responsibility to push the conversation forward through our photography until we're all equal, and that those people who, in my case, I'm not gay, but I have a lot of friends who are, and, some of my best friends in the world. And I feel like I have, somebody who's never going to be challenged on adopting children. I would be able to get married to a man and it be called a marriage, not a civil partnership. I'm never going to have a church turn me away. I'm never going to have a bakery turn me away because they won't make my wedding cake. Do you know what I mean? I don't have to be scared of who I hold hands in the street with. So I think, to take that as one example of privilege, I have a duty, and I think we all do, in my protest photography, when I back things like LGBTQ rights, that I have a responsibility to push that conversation forward through photography until we're all equal. And so that then those people who do experience that have a platform equal to mine to talk about that. Because until we're all equal, then nobody is, as far as I'm concerned. If not all religions, races, colours, sexualities, genders, whatever, until we're all equal, no one is. It's kind of that, if they can keep us divided and split up and arguing with each other and hating on each other instead of hating on the people we should be hating on, not naming any names, then, yeah, that's the way they control us. It's like Animal Farm. Do you know what I mean? So I do think that representation is really, really important. Really important.
And to be fair, everybody has probably more in common than they think.
Yeah, no, definitely. If we spent more time... Do you know what one of my favourite quotes of all time is? There's this wonderful quote where two characters in a film, and I remember this, I was like, 8 or 9 years old, there's two characters in a film, and one of them looks up at the sky and says something, and the other one says, yeah, you're right, the sky is really beautiful tonight. And this character says, we share so many things. We share the same earth, the same sky, the same air. Imagine if we spent more time looking at what we had in common than what was different. Do you know what I mean? And it's this beautiful little moment in this film, and it's from Mewtwo Strikes Back, which was the first Pokemon film. And I can remember seeing that whenever it came out in the cinema when I was like 8 or 9 or whatever. And yeah, that's always stuck with me, and that's a kid's film. So I've always remembered that. And that's the thing I do try to look at that, even with people that I disagree with or I don't get on with, or people who are not particularly nice to me, or, I do try and focus on some of the things we have in common, rather than just getting cross, I guess. Keeping that anger in, like we were talking about before.
I don't think not having anger is healthy, but I think having that anger in check maybe, or balanced, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
What influences you, or who influences you as an artist?
So when I was a kid, when I was little, so I've always been a weird kid. I'm not going to lie about it. I've always been weird. Like, when my mates were reading Twilight when I was a teenager, I was reading Catcher in a Rye, When my mates had Zac Efron on their posters on their walls, I had like all that kind of thing, High School Musical, all that stuff. There's just, I was watching Edward Scissorhands when they were watching High School Musical, Nightmare Before Christmas, do you know what I mean? Like, but I always felt that. I always felt that was weird. I always felt that I was different. I always felt there was more to life than talking about cute boys and cute iPhone covers. And I wanted to talk about politics and, Marxism, and listen to read Noam Chomsky books or whatever. And there were two of the main people that got me through that as a very young person, as a little kid, were Robin Williams and Jim Carrey. Like, I'm not saying I agree with everything they've ever said and done. They're not angels, and Robin Williams especially, he was a huge saving grace for me as a kid. Especially in the film Flubber. I can remember his character. I really identified with his character in Flubber when I was like, however old I was when it came out, 5 or something. And he kind of made it okay to be the way that I was. And I mean, actors-wise, people like Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Tom Hanks, things that they said about acting, like I quoted Jim Carrey earlier, that you can sort of equate to any sort of art form, I think they're amazing. And David Lynch, I mean, legend. Some questionable photography, but everything else I love and approve. But yeah, photography-wise, I'm embarrassed some people, some of my teachers that I talked about before who really, really did, and I don't know if I've ever told them, they really did save my life, like quite literally. And that was like Mick Williamson, Susan Andrews, some amazing Heather McDonough, Rod Morris. Like, there was some really, Anya Dombrowska, another one, really amazing people that I super needed at that point in my life. It kind of links to representation you were talking about as well, because I think one of the things that struck me when I went to university, me and my friend Richard were like literally the only Northerners in all of fine art and photography. And we were kind of like, what's going on? Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, and it was really clearly obvious who came from working class backgrounds and who didn't, by camera equipment, the kind of frames they could get for their exhibitions, the kind of, And Richard was from Huddersfield, actually, just up the road from Leeds. And weirdly, we knew some of the same people, which was quite odd. But yeah, and two of my biggest influences, probably going to kill me for saying this, but when I was kind of in like my year 2 of my BA, this photographer walked in to do alternative print workshops with us called David George, who's from Stockton-on-Tees. I think he's from Stockton-on-Tees. But he walked in a pair of boots and turn-up jeans and a Harrington jacket with a northern accent, and I went, oh my God. Like, this guy, as soon as he opened his mouth, I was like, this is crazy, because everybody sounds posh to me in London and my accent sounds really common. Like, I think it stands out. And also I started to dress a certain way at uni. I started to like not wear Harrington jackets and not wear Doc Martens and kind of think to be taken seriously. I had to dress really quote unquote smartly, you know. And when David walked in, and he was this northerner with this incredible photography work who'd exhibited in galleries and done all this amazing stuff, and he co-founded in certain states and all these things. And I was like, oh my God, a northerner who's killing it, basically. And that was so amazing to me. And it was the same thing with another person who's going to kill me as well. Sorry, David, if you're listening. The other person who's going to kill me is Laura Noble. So when we were on BA, our head of department, Mick, was very good at making us go to exhibitions and saying, you should check this out and you should check that out and you should do this. And one of the things I did was go to as much as I could to meet as many people as I could. To also stalk my favourite photographers as well. Like, one of the people who was at everything I went to was Laura Noble, who's the director of the LA Noble Gallery. And she was at everything, and obviously she does Fixed Photo Festival as well, which I've been to. And she was this gallery director with a huge furry coat on, which I have loads of those. You know, she had this fantastic makeup on, big hair, big personality, big everything, from Manchester. And I was like, oh my God. It was, you know, that was the other thing. I was like, oh my God, she's from Manchester and look at this. I can remember being at the Barge House exhibition that she did that was for Fixed Photo Festival, I think, thinking, oh my God, she comes from Manchester and she can do this. It was really weird. And it was funny because the only other time I've ever heard anyone say this, there was this, sorry to talk about this trashy programme, but on The Apprentice one year, a girl won it who actually went to my high school. After me, she was younger than me, but I didn't know her. But in the dreaded interviews that they have near to the end of the series, she got chatting to one of the interviewers, who I think might actually be from Leeds. I can't remember. Is it Linda? But this girl who actually went on to win it, she broke down and said she wanted to make something of herself because everyone said nobody leaves Garforth. I can't remember if she said nobody leaves Garforth or nobody leaves Leeds. And Garforth's the town I grew up in, so that's my high school. And she was really determined to make something of herself. And people had told her that she'd never do it because of where she was from. So that's the only time. And I feel really bad because I didn't back her as a winner. But she did go on to win it. And that was one of the big things. You know, I was glad it wasn't just me who felt like that. But it was, David and Laura that I kind of first saw and went, oh my God, maybe I've got a chance, you know. That gave me a hell of a lot of confidence. But yeah, so that's kind of my influences, I guess. Yeah. There's a lot of musical ones, but I won't bore you with the details.
But just as you're talking, you know, and that's kind of a theme that comes up a bit, you know, being able to see yourself, actually, if they can do it, if that person can do it, then I can as well. But also, I mean, I know you well enough through London Independent Photography, and you're on the committee for that doing, can't remember all that you do, but certainly doing the regular kind of talks that London Independent Photography does. I know you do a whole lot of curating, you do photography, and you just seem to have so many things on. You know, I think everybody has that self-doubt. Not everybody, but I think a lot of people have that self-doubt, you know, particularly artists. You know, it's kind of like, am I good enough or can I do this? But I'm looking at you thinking, God, you're kind of like, you're curating shows at, you know, pretty good galleries. You're doing kind of stuff for London Independent Photography, and I'm sure there's a whole slew of stuff that I don't know about. Do you want to talk a little bit about that briefly? Because it just seems like you have so much that you're involved with.
I'll come back to that. One of the things I've just sort of listened to you talk was that you said about seeing other people, and I just had a brainwave just now when we were talking about influences, and then you were just saying about seeing other people and thinking, oh, I can do that. The phrase imposter syndrome gets used so frequently by people in the arts, so frequently. And when I was on my third year of my BA, I learned a really valuable lesson. We had Steve McLeod from Metro Imaging come in, and he was going to look around all our graduation work and then pick one of us to mentor. And we all got feedback. We all met up in studios afterwards, and he gave us feedback to our faces and in front of all our peers and everything and our teachers. And Steve went round and gave everybody feedback and said, this and this, and it was all lovely. When it got to me, now the graduation work that I did, I had tiny photo montage, darkroom prints that had taken me months to make. I'd had to use tweezers. They were tiny darkroom prints. And they were in glass bottles with something that was supposed to look like formaldehyde. And they were, find this on my Instagram highlights. And they were presented on a shelf. And the other piece was a butterfly box that was my nana's. And she collected butterflies. Ethically, by the way. And I had some more of these montages like pinned into this butterfly box. And he turned to me in front of everybody and said to me, oh, I don't think you're a photographer. I think you're a fine artist. And I was absolutely livid with my feedback. I think because everybody else got really constructive feedback and I didn't. I got that. And even one of my teachers, Sue, said, I really disagree with him about that. She wasn't best pleased. But what I was going to say was, it did give me this really bad kind of self-doubt, like imposter syndrome. Like, so do I have to work a certain way? And this is why I get cross at, they can sue me if they want, but I get cross at the Royal Photographic Society. And I'm really sorry if anybody listening is a fellow or whatever the next level's up or whatever they are, members of RPS or whatever. But I will never, ever pay anybody to tell me that I am good enough a photographer to be in their club. Like, I will never do that. Like, I had a look online not long ago, and I think you have to pay, I think the second stage is like £100 and something. And I just thought, I feel like that is very predatory, because I feel like there will be a lot of people out there with self-doubt about themselves, about the level of photographer they are, that will then pay that money for some people at the RPS who they don't even know to say whether their work is good enough, you can be in our club or not. And can you imagine the amount of people that they say no to? Or like you get into the first stage and you don't get into the second stage, and people will really try really, really hard. Art is subjective. You can't judge it like that. If you could, you'd get into every single open call you entered, but it's not. And it's not because you're not good enough, it's because your work didn't speak to that person, And that just came up in my head when we were talking about, that kind of representation is important. But that's just something that really winds me up. As somebody I've spent a long time going, am I good enough? I just think that, self-belief is absolutely paramount. Like, that's the main thing.
No, I agree with you. That's a really good point to make. And that's one thing that I've struggled with as well, in terms of, what's good, what's not. And it is so subjective. But maybe briefly just talk a little bit about some of the projects you've done or you're working on.
So photographic projects wise, I've got an ongoing project called Healing from a Narcissist, which I have no idea how long that project's going to take. There's about 5 stages so far. It could end up being 10 or 100. I don't know how many years that's going to go on for. And that's kind of a raising awareness of narcissistic personality syndrome and narcissistic victim syndrome, which is a form of PTSD, which is quite challenging. And it kind of chronicles the recovery from narcissistic abuse, which I kind of describe that as an internal civil war, to be honest. But and then the other kind of bit more lighthearted thing, I'm doing a project about from the River Lee source until to Hackney Marsh and to it ends, which is a bit of a landscape project. Doing a bit of work with Laura Noble. She's going to be curating at Photo London. which is going to be fantastic. It's going to be good to be back with Laura because I used to intern with her before I was friends with her. And we worked on Photo 50 in 2019 at London Art Fair. So it'll be good to be back with Laura and some familiar faces. So that's exciting. Carrying on with the London Independent Photography Talks, we've launched an industry experts panel, which features Laura Noble herself, Zelda Cheadle, Anya Dombrowska and Susan Andrews, who are all going to be offering portfolio reviews, work development, mentoring, anything you can think of at a really discounted price for LIP members only. So that's a real sort of privilege to have those four on the schedules that they're on. So if you're interested in that, you can look up the LIP website. I'll be curating a show in Southend in June, which will be at the Little Known Studio, which is run by a painter called Andy Downs. And I've been invited to curate a show there, and I'm taking the fabulous Tau Collective with me, which was founded by Adam Lucy, and I'll be putting their work into Andy's gallery, which is fantastic because he's not based in London and we are, and it's going to be a nice way to get in front of a new audience and get him to know some new artists that he doesn't know. And yeah, so definitely look up Little Known Studio. It's absolutely gorgeous. And the other thing that I will be doing is I'll be curating a show called Silent Voice at the Nehru Centre in Mayfair, which is the cultural wing of the High Commission of India in the UK. And that's work by Bunshi Chandaria, who's an absolutely wonderful photographer, which that'll be raising money for Alzheimer's UK. So that'll be a really fantastic show. It's a real privilege to kind of be invited to do it, you know, kind of on reputation, which is nice. Other than that, sorting out my website. And kind of hoping a gallery will take a punt on giving me a job would be the other thing. But yeah, that's kind of what I've got going on at the moment.
Well, great. It sounds like you have quite a lot on and some very different and diverse things that you're working on. So thank you. It's been wonderful chatting with you, and it's been so interesting to hear about your art and your journey.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. It was really, really good to be invited, and I think it's a really amazing series, and I can't wait to hear some more of them. Thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode with Jenny. I hope you enjoyed it. More information about Jenny, as well as the podcast, are in the podcast notes. If you're able to, please rate and review the podcast in the podcast apps. In the final episode of this series, I speak with Nisa Dewuji, who is a sports and portrait photographer and also an art director and is based in London, England. Here's a clip of her conversation.
I think for me, I just want to capture a real and raw essence of anyone who comes and sits in front of me. I got told once that you should pose females in a certain way and they should look more feminine. Well, I'm not that kind of girl, so I wouldn't like it if so I kind of decided to create images that were more representative of the type of women I shoot. I try not to edit at all where possible, so they are just raw images converted to black and white or remaining in colour, and I keep it as real as I can because then it's a better representation of the subject.
I look forward to you joining me in the final episode with Anissa.